Welcome everyone to Sarasota County. I am Scott Lempe, the Assistant Superintendent and Chief Operating Officer for Sarasota District Schools, and it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to what we believe is Florida's finest school district. And if you don't know why we feel that way, hopefully by the time I get done talking this morning, you'll at least understand why we feel that way. As I stand here, by the way, in the Media Center of Riverview High School, one of our newest and certainly our largest school, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. This is kind of a roadmap for what I'll talk about the next 20 minutes or so. First, I want to just give you an introduction to the organization that you're coming to work for. I'll start off with just a snapshot of our vision and our vision statement, what that means to our organization, talk a little bit about our mission statement, talk just a little bit about the big picture of education in the state of Florida, and there are some things that are different. So if you're not from Florida, I'll point out what a couple of those are. I'll introduce you to our organizational structure. I'll start with the school board and I'll work myself down hopefully to a place where all of you can see where you fit in that organizational structure. I'll then spend a fair amount of time talking about some of the things that we're most proud of as an organization, really with the focus there on student achievement and measurably how are our kids doing. I'll talk just a little bit about money. My goal there is not to make you budget experts, but to introduce you kind of from a 30,000 foot level where our money comes from and how we spend it. And then I'll finish that part of the presentation with kind of a historical perspective of our voted millage referendum. And if you don't know what that is, don't panic. We'll talk about it when we get there. So if that sounds good, we'll just get started. On this particular picture, you can see our vision statement as it's written. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. You can do that yourself, but probably two pieces of it I'd like to foot stomp. First, if you look in about the middle of the vision statement, you see the words all learners. To me, those words are really important, and they're in our vision statement because as an organization, as a matter of culture, we believe all children can learn. And I foot stomp that a little bit because if you're one who doesn't, and I think there are those who are out there, this morning might be a good opportunity for you to ask yourself, am I coming to work in the right organization? Because we believe that all of our staff believe all children can learn. The other part of the vision statement that I like to talk about a little bit is it ends by saying, productive, responsible, and healthful lives. My background is military, and as a result of that, I am probably corny patriotic. But when I read that part of the vision statement, what it says to me is we're in the business of producing the next generation of citizens of our country. Folks, that's as important as it gets, and that's why it's in our vision statement. So let's talk about mission. Mission statement, as I think you know, really says what it is you do for a living as an organization. And so again, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but a couple of pieces of it I think are important. First is, you'll see that part of it says prepare students. You would expect to see something like that in the mission statement of every public K-12 education, because that's what we do at the end of the day, right? We prepare kids. The other part of the mission statement, though, that I like is it talks about using an engaged and high-quality staff, involved parents, and a supportive community. I like that because as a society, we have a tendency to blame everything on the classroom teacher. My student, my kid is not performing well, it must be because they have a bad teacher. And I guess I would tell you that that's just nonsense. Even the very best teacher in the world can't succeed without the right group of people around them, starting with mom or dad or the guardian, whoever the significant people are in the lives of the children. So that's why I like the fact that that's in our mission statement. One of the unique things about public education in the state of Florida is that by law, counties and school districts are synonymous. There are 67 counties in the state of Florida. By law, then, there are 67 school districts. Now, one of the outcomes of that is some pretty big districts. Now, if your frame of reference is the Midwest or the Northeast, and you're used to these little community school districts that have 2 elementary schools that may feed 1 middle school, that one may feed 1 high school, Florida is different. Not better or worse, just different. I remember the year that I came to work for Sarasota County. The year that I retired from the military, there were 375,000 men and women in the active duty United States Air Force. There were about 400,000 kids in the Miami-Dade school system. A function of this relationship legally between counties and school districts. The other piece of this that's maybe worth mentioning a little is you see a bullet that talks about us operating under the authority of the Department of Education. And I guess when I read that, I think maybe that's a bit of a stretch of the truth practically. On a day-to-day basis, I don't care a lick what the Department of Education thinks. I care what the superintendent of schools thinks. Now, the reason it's on the slide, though, is because I will tell you that the DOE influences how we do business a lot, primarily through their interaction with the Florida legislature. Florida School Law Book is about that thick. It's written in about 8 font, and there's a ton of really practical stuff in there. Part of the reason that you're hearing this presentation this morning is because there's a statute that says we have to have some of this conversation before you can work with our kids. There's statute that tells us what your probation period looks like. There's statute that tells us how we evaluate teachers. Just a lot of really practical stuff. So, well, I would argue we don't really operate under the authority of the DOE. They certainly influence how we do business. What I've tried to do here is just compare the size of our schools to other schools around the state of Florida and across the nation as a whole. So, for example, if you look at the bar that is kind of purplish blue, this is how we ended the 16-17 school year. So what you'll see is that at the high school level, for example, the average high school across the nation was just shy of about 900 students. If you look at the comprehensive high schools in the state of Florida, the average high school was just over 1,700 students. And if you looked at just the 5 comprehensive high schools in Sarasota, and I am not including, by the way, Pineview or Oak Park that have high school age kids, just our 5 comprehensive high schools, we averaged just shy of 2,000 students in our schools. And I will tell you that this school right here, Riverview High School, where we are today, where we're filming, is the largest of those comprehensive high schools, about 2,450 students. So here I'm just trying to show you a snapshot of our student body. You can kind of see where our kids are, at least as we ended last school year. And I will tell you that these numbers are so precise that they are precisely wrong. They change every single day as kids enroll and disenroll. You see that most of our kids are at the elementary level, and that's just math. There are 6 grade levels there, kindergarten through 5, so that's where most of our kids are. I also like to use this slide as an opportunity. Notice the bullet that says 2 exceptional schools. Let me introduce you to what those schools are. They are Oak Park and Pineview. Now let me start with Pineview. So Pineview is a 2 through 12 school for gifted students. Anecdotally, at least, I can tell you people moved to Sarasota County to put their kids in Pineview school. This last year, I think their high school was ranked like number 6 in the nation as an academically competitive high school. One of the base criteria to get into the school is to have an IQ of above 130. Wonderful, wonderful academically competitive school. Kind of at the other end of the spectrum is Oak Park School. Oak Park is a K through 12 school for emotionally, mentally, and physically handicapped students. If you work at Oak Park or you're going to work at Oak Park, a heartfelt thank you to you. It takes a very special kind of a person to be successful with those incredible kids. If you don't work at Oak Park and you ever get an invitation to go, seize the opportunity, because you will see things happen at Oak Park every day that don't happen anywhere else in our district. And let me give you just kind of one personal story of what I mean by that. Shortly after I came to work for the district, I got invited to Oak Park's high school graduation. A very small class. The entire school, K through 12, is under 400 today. So the graduating class was about 35 students. They held the graduation in their cafeteria. So they had the students sitting up on the stage and the parents down on the cafeteria floor. And the principal was calling the students' names. By the way, presenting them with a standard diploma, the same one that you would get at Venice High School. And the principal is calling the students' names. She calls this one young lady's name. She's a 17-year-old quadriplegic girl. So the principal calls her name. She's in a wheelchair that she makes move by blowing in a tube. So the principal calls her name. She blows in this tube. She rolls her wheelchair up in front of the stage. The principal laid a standard diploma in her lap. She blew in the tube and rolled her wheelchair away from the stage. Just for me, a very powerful memory that I'll take for the rest of my life about the kinds of things that happen at Oak Park School. This is kind of my last number slide, sort of gee whiz numbers about the district. You can kind of see the size of our staff. Again, these numbers change certainly as we hire and fire and people resign and retire and those kinds of things. Probably the most significant number on this slide, though, is that very bottom one that talks about our volunteer population. One of the benefits of living in a retiree-rich community like Sarasota is there are a lot of people that have a lot of life experience. They have time on their hands and they want to share that experience with somebody. And so they come to the school board to do that. And I always look at that number and I say, if it's really true that we have 10,000 volunteers who give us $6 million of effort every day, if they were to walk away tomorrow, would we cease to operate as an organization? Probably not. Would we continue to be one of only 6 or 8 A districts in the state of Florida? I don't know. I mean, that's a heck of a lot of effort that's making our schools better. So let me switch gears one more time and talk just a little bit about organizational structure. So when you look at this slide, first of all, you see a picture of our 5 board members. If you look real close, you'll see that all 5 of them have a smile on their face. I would encourage you to look real closely because you'll probably never see all 5 of them happy at the same time again. I start with the board, though, really for 2 practical reasons, how they impact you. First is by law, school boards are empowered to set policy. So if you want to change a policy, if you want to create one, if you want to eliminate one that is already there, you can do that. You can personally influence that, but only through the formal action of the school board because they own policy. Second, and probably more significant, is our school board controls our purse strings. So when we walk across the street and we bargain your salaries with our union, we do so with the authority of our school board. If you are a substitute teacher, your daily rate is set by the school board. So there really are some practical ways that the school board impacts you, beginning with policy and money, particularly as it relates to your salary. When I think about who the boss is, though, I don't think about a board member or the board as a group. I think about the superintendent of schools. The superintendent is appointed by the board to run the day-to-day operations of our district. You heard earlier today a short message from Dr. Bowden. Homegrown guy by some definition. We hired him into the superintendency from being the executive director of career and technical education, so he brought some local experience into the job. He's been our superintendent now just a little less than a year. But when I think about who the boss is, I think about the superintendent. This is kind of a snapshot of the superintendent's cabinet. It is a pretty traditional makeup of superintendent's cabinets. And this is a group that, at least theoretically, gets together about once a week and talks about the strategic direction of the districts, talks about how we're doing educating our students, what mid-course corrections do we need to make to continue to improve the quality of instruction that happens in our classroom. How does that show up in our classrooms? The cabinet itself, we could talk all day about just that. I picked 2 things. I picked teacher quality and budget. Now, let me start with teacher quality. I don't know that having a graduate education necessarily makes you a better teacher, but the fact that we're able to recruit and retain such a high percentage of teachers with graduate education tells me that something's working in Sarasota County schools. When I talk about budget, you're going to see that about 90 cents of every general fund dollar we spend finds its way directly to a school. That's on purpose because we believe the closer to the kids the money is, the more significant an impact it has on the learning of those students. This is my team. This is essentially the business operation of the district. I guess I show this in part because it's my presentation, so I can, and in part a little bit to show off the people that really support the success of teachers in the classroom. Now, how does that show up in the classroom? And I'll get on a soapbox for just a second. I would tell you that I think it shows up as probably the least appreciated group of people in our district today, and that is our classified staff. We can't be successful without them. We take them for granted every day, and shame on us for doing it. And let me give you just 2 examples of why I say that. If you're a classroom teacher, ask yourself this question. Who's the first person to see your kids every day? The bus driver. And as a teacher, how often do you think about that bus driver's impact on your ability to be successful today? Forget about the fact that they get your kids to school safe. Forget about the fact that they get them to school on time. Just think about the impact they have on the way they treat your kids, especially the small ones, right? So if I'm a warm, welcoming kind of a person, and every day I welcome your student onto my bus, and at the end of the day I say, have a great evening, Johnny, I'll be here tomorrow to get you safely to school, that kid shows up in your classroom ready to learn. If the opposite is true, and I am just kind of naturally mean and nasty and hard to get along with, and that's how I treat your kid, they show up in your classroom mad at their bus driver, not thinking about learning. And as a classroom teacher, how often do you think about that? The other example I would give you is right now today, as I stand here, almost exactly 50% of our kids qualify for free or reduced lunch. Look around the community of Sarasota, that's a number that's hard to believe. Every year it's hard to believe, but it's true. What that means, though, is for many of those students, the only warm, nutritious meal they're going to get today is the one they're served by your cafeteria staff. In many cases, breakfast, lunch, and supper. What that means is they come back into your classroom after lunch thinking about learning, not thinking about their tummy. Pretty significant thing that I just don't think we think about often enough. So I will now get off my soapbox. I want to talk about some things that we're proud of. And I find that this is a good place to start. It's a bit dated, but I just think the power in the words. So back in 2011, 2012, a group of citizens came to the school board and said, we would like to bring in an outside entity to review the operations of the district and make some recommendations on how you could perhaps do them more efficiently, more effectively. And so we thought about that for a while and thought, why would we turn down free advice on how to do better? So we welcomed them in. They spent several months with us peeling back the onion on all of our operations. They outbriefed their findings at the Chamber of Commerce downtown, and this was the opening slide of their team leader. What he said to the group at the Chamber was that Sarasota County Schools was one of the best run organizations they had ever visited. I start with that because it's kind of a disinterested third-party evaluation that says good things are happening in Sarasota County Schools. On the business side, we have tons to be proud of. If you work in food service, you're about to join what I would argue is certainly the finest food service department in all of the state of Florida, if not the best, one of the best in the nation. There are literally thousands of food service departments around the country today. As of last time I checked, there were only 33 who had been awarded this thing called District of Excellence. You are about to come to work in one of those. We, like you, have a credit rating. We're rated by organizations like Standard & Poor's and Fitch. Our credit rating today is among the very best in the state of Florida, and that's on purpose. We're very careful with how we spend our taxpayers' money. When I think about things we're proud of, though, we really have to talk about student achievement because that's the business we're in, and that's frankly what we are the most proud of. You can see here that today we are an A district, and in fact we are one of only 2 districts in the state of Florida that has remained an A since the state started grading schools with school grades. This is a bit of a complicated slide, but there's really important information on here, so let me kind of orient you to it and then talk about what I think you see here, because I would argue that what you see here is both good news and bad news, or at least good news and a challenge for all of us that work for the district. So what's on this slide is kind of an over time perspective of Sarasota's reading and math scores as compared to the state of Florida as a whole. So the 2 red lines represent Sarasota County, the 2 blue lines represent the state of Florida. You'll notice that there are 2 vertical white lines. What those white lines represent is times when the benchmark assessment changed. 2011, the data dips a little, and that isn't because all of a sudden our kids were performing lower, it's because the benchmark assessment changed. What it took to perform on grade level was tougher to achieve. So fewer of our kids, as a percentage, achieved that. You'll see the same thing in 2013 when we went from FCAT 2.0 to what is now the Florida Standard Assessment. So I just want you to understand what those little dips represent. When I look at this chart, though, I think there's both good news and bad news. If I were to put a kind of a trend line in either one of these sections of this graph, I think we would all argue that that trend line is generally up. That's positive. Every year you would like to see a higher and higher percentage of your students achieving on or above grade level. So that's the good news. The bad news or the challenge is, wouldn't you like to go to those 2016 numbers and just grab a hold of them and move them up about 15 percentage points on that graph? You really would. So when I look at this slide, we're proud of what our kids are doing. We're proud of the trends in our data, but there's still some work to do because we'd like to see 100% of our students ultimately achieving either on or above grade level. I won't bore you with the details. You can read this slide yourself, but the message in the words on this slide, quite simply, is that regardless of what grade level you look at or what subject matter area you look at, we pretty dramatically outperform the state of Florida peer group that we're benchmarked against. One of the questions I get asked a lot, though, is it's great that you're doing well as compared to the state of Florida, but we hear all these things about Florida's education. How are you doing as compared to the nation as a whole? That's a tough question to answer because there aren't a lot of nationally normed assessments. One of them that is nationally normed is the SAT. So what I'm trying to show you here is how our kids perform both relative to the state of Florida and the nation as a whole on the SAT. You'll see that last year our kids outperformed the state of Florida and outperformed the nation as a whole by over 100 points on the SAT. So at least one nationally normed indication that things are going well in Sarasota County. This is just another way to look at SAT data. It's kind of a longitudinal snapshot of how we're doing. What you see here is, and again, we are the kind of blue, purple colored bar. The state of Florida is red and the nation as a whole is gray. You can see that not only every year do we outperform both the state of Florida and the nation as a whole, but notice the trend is up every year too. So the average score that our students achieving is going up every year. So good news across the board, I think. Lastly, I'd like to talk just a little bit about graduation rates and dropout rates. This last year, our graduation rate in Sarasota County was in excess of 85%. That is the highest graduation rate we've had in the history of Sarasota County schools. So I'm real proud of that. I joke all the time that the guy in charge, who's probably my dearest friend in the world, but the guy in charge of our high schools is from West Virginia, and even with a guy from West Virginia in charge, our kids are doing well. Our dropout rate last year was 1.1%. That is not an all-time low, but it's close. Our all-time low dropout rate was 0.9%. By the way, if you're a mathematician and you say, why doesn't graduation plus dropout equal 100%? It's because the two measures look at different cohorts of kids. So if they ever equal 100%, it's by accident. So let's switch gears a second and just talk for a couple of minutes about budget. And again, as I said, my goal is to not make you budget experts, but just give you a feel for where our money comes from and how we spend it. So here in this pie chart, you see where our money comes from. And there are a couple of things that are really interesting that you see in this graph. First of all, people ask me all the time, what do you do with all the money that you get from the federal government? And you can see on this slide that as a percentage of our overall budget, that's a pretty small percentage of the money we spend. What's really interesting about this slide is that big red piece of the pie. That's what comes from our taxpayers in the form of ad valorem. I will tell you that the taxpayers of Sarasota County are supportive of education. They support it with their wallets. With that support comes a responsibility to be responsible with their money, but you can see by this slide that they are very, very supportive of public education. When I talk about how we spend it, as you might expect, education is a pretty labor-intensive business. So when you look at this slide, you see that the lion's share of our general fund is spent on salary and benefits. Now, when you look at that slide, again, there is both good news and bad news. The good news is part of the reason that that green piece of the pie, the salary and benefits piece, is large is because I would argue that we pay competitively. Now, any one of you who joined public education as a way to get rich, I'm going to tell you that you made a really bad decision a long time ago. But almost whatever it is you do, I would argue that we pay competitively. For teachers, you can go on the DOE website and you can compare your salary to other districts across the state of Florida, and you will find that we are always number one or number two. When we're number two, we're behind Monroe County. That's the Keys. The cost of living down there is just expensive. But that is not by accident. We drive our teacher salaries up on purpose because we believe that good education starts with the best teacher at the front of the classroom, and it takes, frankly, more than the beaches to get you to come here. So we do that competitively. If you're a bus driver, or a food service worker, or a custodian, you're not getting rich by any means either, but if you look at what others in your business are being paid locally, you will see that your salaries and benefit package are certainly competitive, particularly when you think about things like benefits and retirement. The bad news as I look at this slide is during economic downturns, like we just experienced, if I need to make a significant reduction in the budget, it's hard to do that without touching salary and benefits. That's where all the money is. And so I would tell you during this most recent economic downturn, we did some uncomfortable things to our people. We asked our staff to take unpaid furlough days. We whittled away at the robustness of your benefits package. Now that's starting to come back, but because we have so much of our general fund invested in people, when the economy goes bad, we are forced sometimes to do those uncomfortable things to our staff. Lastly, just kind of functionally how we spend our money. Remember earlier that I said about 90 cents of every general fund dollar finds its way to the classroom? Well, where that number came from was adding together the blue piece of this pie, which is essentially your principal's budgets, which goes directly to the school. To that, I added the red piece of this pie, which is labeled school support, and I added it because mostly what's in there is curriculum support and teacher staff development. Directly impacts quality of instruction. So if you add those two things together, today the number is about 93% of every general fund dollar finds its way into a school directly. The last topic I wanted to talk about as part of this part of the presentation is the referendum. And I want to talk about it, I guess, from a historical perspective. So I'm going to roll the clock back to about 2002. In 2002, our school board saw a train wreck coming. And that train wreck was in the form of maybe three things at least happening at the same time. In that year, they took a fairly significant reduction in their budget because, at least in part, of declining property values. There was this looming thing called the class size amendment. If the class size amendment passes, which those of you from Florida know that it did, we're going to be forced to hire more teachers and build more classrooms to put them in. Both of those things cost money, and the budget is declining. And at that time, there's a growth in this thing that we refer to as the achievement gap, or the academic performance between white kids and black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, rich kids, poor kids. However you define the achievement gap, it was growing. That's a train wreck. And so the board talked about what options do we have to address that train wreck. And obviously one of them was money. And so they talked about the wisdom of going to the community and asking the community, how would you feel if we wanted to assess one more mill against your property? Now, if you're a property owner, you know that 1 mill equals $1 for every $1,000 value of your home. The citizens of Sarasota County overwhelmingly supported that referendum. I think the initial yes vote was in the range of 64%, which as general elections go, that is indeed a landslide. It was a 4-year referendum, so it ran to 2006. We went back to the voters in 2006 and said we would like to continue to assess, not add more, but continue to assess that 1 mill. Again, the voters supported the referendum. So if you just kind of do the math and carry it forward, 2006 took us to 2010. We went back to the voters then. The 2010 referendum took us to 2014. The most recent referendum, 2014, took us to 2018. So we'll begin our referendum campaign here very shortly. And again, what we'll be asking the voters to consider is to allow us to continue to levy that additional 1 mill. Just a historical perspective of our referendum. So initially we went to our community and we asked them, if we did have an additional millage rate, what would you like us to spend that money on? And here you see just some of the list of things that the voters said were important to them. Probably most significantly was the length of the teacher duty day. Prior to the referendum, the teacher's duty day was 7 hours. Today, the teacher duty day is 7.5 hours. Now that difference doesn't sound like a lot, but the bulk of that additional 30 minutes is contact time with students. Funny, when I ask teachers, what do you need to be successful? The first thing I hear typically is, I need more time with my kids. So extending the teacher duty day did that by 30 minutes a day, times 180 days, that's not insignificant. Think about it though, from the teacher's perspective, your duty day just got essentially 7% longer. And so when we did that, we increased teachers' salaries by 7% to acknowledge that they were working harder and longer. And so some of our millage today, some of the additional millage is spent on teacher salaries. I'd like to leave you with just a couple of general thoughts, and you can see them here. But first of all, we really are a big district. You saw the numbers with a lot of work to do. We have 42,000, 43,000 students out there on a daily basis counting on you to put them first and do the right thing. You saw in our student achievement slides that while we are excited and proud of what we've done, there is some work to do to improve our measures of student achievement. I would tell you that as an organization, we have a pretty positive reputation in the community. As a new employee, I would tell you for you that's both good news and bad news, or at least good news and a challenge. The good news is I think most of us would rather work for a company with a good reputation than a bad one, right? The challenge or the bad news is that reputation has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the person you're replacing. And so when you step into that role, I would argue that you pick up a gauntlet from them and agree to carry it with the same dedication and commitment that the person you're replacing did. I would tell you that you're joining a really proud team. There's a bullet on here that talks about no one piece is more important than the other. That's really a reminder of two things: the significant role that the classified staff play in the success of our teachers in our classrooms, and the role that our volunteers play. You will see them everywhere in our district. Thank them when you do, because they really do make a difference. Let me close with this thought. I mentioned earlier that my background was military. I had my 19th birthday in basic training, and so pretty much my entire adult life, every morning started off the same. I got up in the morning, I put on a uniform, I looked in a mirror, and I was proud of what was looking back. I was proud of what my uniform stood for. When I retired from the military, I wanted to continue to feel that. It wasn't about making money or making widgets for me. It was about continuing to make a difference. And I really struggled with what to do next. I had 2 kids in college. I couldn't afford to retire, and so I was struggling with that question, what to do next. Almost as a matter of luck, I got a phone call from a local gentleman by the name of Richard Hayes. Richard actually sat in my job 2 or 3 removed from me. He called me, I was in Tampa. He called me on the phone and said, "Scott, I'd like you to come down and talk to me about a job." And for me, a light bulb went on and said, if you're really serious about wanting to continue to make a difference and not make a lot of money, public education is the place. And so I moved here in 2003 and have felt pretty good about that. ever since I got here. I share that with you because I would ask you, you're going to have tough days. And I would ask you, when you have those tough days, reflect for a minute, find a dark, quiet place in your home, preferably a place with a mirror. Stop in front of that mirror. Think about what it is you've chosen to do with this part of your professional life. Think about the impact that you had on a kid today. Pat yourself on the back and be really, really proud of what it is you do for our kids and for Sarasota County Schools.